So some of the things we've already talked about in this unit, starting in the 30s, we can already see Hitler's plans coming to fruition. When he establishes Dachau in 1933, it's primarily for political purposes. Of course, there were some Jews who were included in that, possibly because they were socialists, or maybe they had, for some reason or another, been a political prisoner. Then in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws, which there was already, then in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws. In Germany, there's already quite a bit of anti-Semitism, dislike of the Jews, but these laws make it legal, takes away their citizenship essentially, makes it very difficult for them to make a living. But really, historically, the first major event of the Holocaust is considered November 9th, 1938. We call this Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Throughout Germany and Austria, there is this widespread violence against Jews. And it must have been planned, it must have been coordinated, because it would be uncanny or very, very strange that these events would happen simultaneously throughout such a large area. So what happened is Nazis began attacking Jewish homes, Jewish businesses. You can see there all of the shattered glass of the storefronts. They tried to attack, burn down as many synagogues as possible. And it wasn't like this was a huge secret. It wasn't completely hidden that these communities or these sections of Germany and Austria had been attacked. Here is the front page of the New York Times. So it was well known that something was going on, but you can also see here Goebbels calls halt, that the Nazis are bringing control back into Germany, preventing further violence against Jews. Now we saw this also with the Armenian genocide, where it's reported in the papers and nobody really does anything. Because in 1938, in the fall of 1938, most of Europe is fearing a war, getting ready for a war. So this is just one of many other things that's going on, and nobody really does anything or says anything about it. What happened was that thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And here we see, just at Dachau, from Kristallnacht, the men who were arrested. There were some who were killed in some of the violence. And this will begin sort of the clear line of demarcation when this widespread violence against the Jews begins. Even though, as of 1938 and Kristallnacht, America was not involved in the war in any way, but we were, in a sense, involved because people were trying to leave Europe to immigrate to America. We did accept what we would term people of exceptional merit. And in the 1930s, that meant people like Einstein, people who we knew could clearly benefit not just America, but the future war effort. Part of the reason why we did not accept so many people goes back to the National Origins Act of 1924, which we've already studied. Remember, this was the law that placed strict quotas on how many people could immigrate to America. And it was usually about 3% of the overall population could come to America, and once that number was reached, no more. And it was all from Europe. So this meant that we would accept some of these Jews seeking asylum, but once that number was hit, we said, sorry, no more. And this brings us to the heartbreaking story of the St. Louis. This was a ship that left Hamburg, the port in Germany, with about 900 civilians on it. It leaves, and it first stopped in Cuba, and only a few, I think 4 or 5 people, were allowed to disembark in Cuba because they had the right paperwork. Then the rest of the people continued on to the United States. No one was allowed to disembark because they didn't have the right paperwork. They didn't have the right visa because they didn't fit into the current quota system. So the St. Louis is forced to turn around, go back to Hamburg. In 1939, this isn't a huge issue because many of these people will say, okay, well, we've left Germany, we'll go find safety elsewhere. They go to Belgium and the Netherlands and France. But the next year, those countries were taken over by Hitler. Some of these people did ultimately make it to safety in the United States, but many of them perished in the Holocaust. Even though they escaped Germany, they didn't escape Europe. So the war progressed. There had been a number of attempts to eliminate Jews since 1938. And we're going to fast forward to 1942. Germans are noted for their organization, their engineering, and at the Wannsee Conference, the Nazi leaders are meeting to discuss what they'll call the final solution to the Jewish question. Using such a euphemism like that, it doesn't sound like it's anything bad necessarily, just we need to organize what's going to happen. There are so many Jews in Europe at this time, and by 1942, the Nazis control the majority of Europe. And the main goal of the Wannsee Conference was to organize registration, transportation, and elimination of Europe's Jews. Now, this will be characteristic of the Nazis, is this planning, this order and decorum in a way, in how they will conduct this violence. By 1942, the Nazis have been in power for 9 years. Yes, there have been some Jews who have been killed, either just through street violence, they've been put in camps, and there's also quite a few who have emigrated, who have left Germany. They could see the writing on the wall, they realized they did not want to stay in this country, even though it was their home. So we have 90,000 who go to America, we have over 80,000 who go to South America. We have many who go to Palestine, which makes sense, especially considering that Jerusalem is there. And even some who go to Shanghai, and still to this day there's a very small Jewish community left in China. But then if you look at that inset, nearly 100,000 who leave Germany just for neighboring countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or France. So that's in the case of the Frank family, as in the Diary of Anne Frank. They left Germany for Netherlands. So that's as of 1940, but then by summer of 1940, Germany has taken over all of those locations. So once again, those German Jews who thought they had fled to safety are back under this dictatorial regime. So by summer of 1940, these German Jews who had escaped Nazi power are once again subject to those same unfair, unequal, racist laws. In 1942, the war's been going on for essentially 2 years. Hitler has attempted and failed at invading Great Britain. He has been fighting in North Africa for a year and a half, trying to hold on to those resources. And he is preparing to invade Russia and take over the rest of Eastern Europe. Now, the reason Germany wanted all of this extra space was to essentially dispose of all of these unwanted peoples. It's called the Hunger Plan, and he was thinking that if he could take the territory, he could then, sort of like a trash dump, take the unwanted people from the center of Germany, export them to the outskirts, and use them as labor. The natives, or the local people, let's say if this was Russia or Poland, they would die, and also the Jews would be used as forced labor, as farmers to provide agriculture to send back to Germany, and it would just be they would die off, and this is how they would eliminate the Jews. So that is the ultimate goal, but until that happens, they're going to need to start doing something else, because there are, at the time, the Germans estimated that there were still 11 million Jews left in Europe to deal with. They needed to find that final solution. You can see on this map, the majority of the ghettos are in the eastern part of Europe, outside of the heart of Germany. So this is trying to start enacting that hunger plan, transporting the Jews out of the heart of Germany. The original purpose is to separate the Jews from the normal population, from the good population. Just let's centralize them so it's easier to deal with them. So they would round up smaller communities, and then they would often sort of block off city streets. So these are urban centers often. In the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, the city's population at the time was 1/3 Jewish, and all of the Jewish population was herded into about 1.5 miles square, and it was blocked. There were barricades put up, there were walls put up, and it would often be very heavily populated. In class, we read through a section of Elie Wiesel's Night, and they said it was an inconvenience, and many of our family members came and lived with us, but that often the Jews felt this was an improvement, that they were, as Elie Wiesel said, entirely among themselves. They could create now their own society apart from the Germans, and they wouldn't have to deal with all of that hostility. And they created their own society, their own police force, their own healthcare system with the limited resources that they had. So we have lots of examples of people in the Jewish community who are essentially cooperating with the Germans because they see that cooperation leads to survival. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, with all of the oppression they have been subjected to, they have learned in centuries that cooperation means survival, and that's better than the alternative. So in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, we have the Jewish population living in this very contained space for years. That was not the norm. It usually was a matter of months. And as the process becomes more streamlined and more efficient, it would only be just a few weeks. So as the surrounding communities' Jews are brought into a central location, they'd be there for a while until transportation could be arranged. Then they would take all of their belongings. They would be packed into essentially cattle cars, sometimes 200 people to a train car, still carrying their belongings. And all of this would be with the cooperation of the Jewish police. In class, we watched the clips from The Pianist, and we see the people being loaded into the trains, and one of the men being pulled out and saved because his friend realized the people who go on the trains aren't coming back. The Germans had been telling the Jews, well, first of all, they were cut off from the outside world as they were put into the ghettos. So they're not hearing news from elsewhere. And then the Germans would tell the Jewish communities that they are being sent to be resettled in the East. They're being transported to work camps out on the East. They'll be able to reestablish their communities, so take as much of your belongings as you can, and we'll go from there. The other clip we watched in class from The Pianist was the example of the random killings of some of the Jewish workers in the ghetto. With some of the larger ghettos, as neighborhoods would be liquidated, then that gave the opportunity for more Jews from other communities to be brought in. The Germans used Jewish labor to maintain the walls, to do other labor. And as many of you asked in class, why didn't they fight back? It's a wonderful question. Why didn't they fight back? And this is the issue with the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jews in Warsaw had been put in the ghetto in essentially 1940. There was almost 500,000 Jews just from the city of Warsaw. There is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but it only takes place after almost 400,000 of those Jews have been deported. They have been transported. The Jews, again, they had learned over centuries that cooperation led to survival. When they finally have to accept the truth that this cooperation is not leading to survival, that no one is coming back, we haven't heard from anyone, that is when they fight back. And the Germans also very specifically tried to maintain calm, tried to keep up this ruse that it was just resettlement. This is a very famous photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto. We do not know who this little boy is. We never learned his name.
But this photo perfectly sort of encapsulates what the ghettos might have been like in the liquidation, that they first have been taken from their homes and their normal communities, and then they resettle in the ghetto, and once again are removed from the ghetto, and then they would be transported to the camps. Now the camps, it would have been purely out of sort of geography. Whichever ghetto they were put in, they would be sent to a camp close in proximity. So for example, the Jews from Warsaw were primarily sent to Treblinka. The Jews from Hungary primarily sent to Auschwitz, and so on.
As the Holocaust continues, there are more and more refugees looking for safety in America. And even though we were involved in the war effort, we were still very wary of allowing any foreigners into our country. And that's because we were afraid that they would be spies, that someone might be posing as a refugee, and they would pretend to be persecuted in order to help out their country's war effort. It's very similar to what's going on right now with the European migrant crisis, where we're afraid of these people coming from Middle Eastern countries. Have they been radicalized? Are they intending to be terrorists? Meanwhile, we have this huge humanitarian issue on our hands. For those that did make it to America and survived, we looked at two different personalities. There was Gerda Weissmann Klein, who was a German Jew, and she married another German Jew whose family had made it to America in the 1930s, and he joined the American Army and helped liberate Germany, and that's where Gerda met her husband. And when she moved to America, she really became an outspoken proponent for citizenship and the rights of the rights of refugees, and a very public and very positive proponent of we should let in people into the American society. That's what has made us great. On the other hand, there's someone like Elie Wiesel, and you probably are familiar with his book Night, and he took a very different perspective on why did he survive, rather than the idea of I've been saved for something greater, a belief in God. Much of Wiesel's experience kind of made him lose his faith. He said when he was on the train, "Never shall I forget that night, that first night in camp that turned my Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never I shall forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself." For Wiesel, he saw this experience not as one of good fortune or being saved by God to carry on good work, but as an abandonment of God. In his time in the camps, he even became defiant, that he accused God of abandoning his people. On the day of Yom Kippur, he says, the Day of Atonement, we asked, should we fast? I did not fast. First of all, to please my father who had forbidden me to do so. And then there was no longer any reason for me to fast. I no longer accepted God's silence. Deep inside me, I felt a great void opening. So he took a very negative perspective, and later in life, he sort of softened up a bit more and also became a champion for citizenship and the rights of refugees. But it's just very interesting to see how people with similar experiences can come away with very different opinions. And for these survivors, the Nuremberg trials are incredibly important. Following the end of the war, those who could be found in the Nazi leadership and anyone who sort of was in charge of these camps was put on trial. And this is really considered the first international trial. These men, these men were accused with various counts, such as crimes against humanity, committing mass murder, and this was a proper trial that they were given a right to counsel, but this was to show that the world community will not allow this to happen. Many of them were sentenced to death as, a way to try and bring some sort of justice to this absolutely horrific event.